Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is October 30th. And
October 30th.
Yeah, tomorrow is Halloween, and we're just
Yeah.
a handful of days from the election. And
Yep.
Nothing says, hey, get ready for the election then, like Fascism Friday. So today we're talking about, was Jesus a fascist? So it's nothing controversial at all today.
No. And, we have our own Friday the 13th here. I was realizing that yesterday, right? This is episode 113. So this is Fascism Friday the 13th, the day before Halloween.
What? You just blew my mind, Dan.
Now, what are you going to be for Halloween, Mark?
I'm going to be someone who never lived up to their potential. This is what the costume is. Now, we didn't think we were going to do anything, and then we were invited to a socially distancing kind of thing with our friends, with the Ellens. And so I'm like, I'll probably wear like one of the masks that I have hanging on my wall. Like there's this fox mask. Right. Maybe I'll throw a mask on. What about you?
Cool. No, we're not going to. No, I'm not doing anything. No, I don't know.
You could try to act really passive aggressive and oddly polite and go as a Minnesotan for Halloween.
Yeah.
I know you've observed it enough to know how to pretend to be like one of those type of Minnesotans.
That's right. Yeah, except I got nowhere to go. So
that's true.
Yeah. Oh yeah, right. So Mark is
going as pumpkin spice. I don't need to go as pumpkin spice. I am pumpkin spice. So if I went as pumpkin spice, it wouldn't be a costume.
Yeah.
That's right. Almost the election, almost daylight savings. Not sure which is worse. I think the election is worse this time. But
yeah, for sure. Yeah. I had a very weird experience last night. So I'm in this book club with a bunch of Canadian Mennonites.
Okay.
And we're reading this great book on Indigenous settler relations in Canada. And so, last night.
Is that a book by Steve Heinrich? Is it that book?
No, but Steve is running the thing. No, it's this book. It's really good.
Yeah, Canada at the Crossroads. Okay.
Yeah. And, but anyway, last night was the first time I was able to go to the little live thing. And so here I am in this little Zoom group with just Canadians. And of course, at some point or another, we got around to talking about the US and the election and Trump. And it was a very odd experience. So first of all, I'm with this group of people and they're all looking from the outside in, right? And they're all like kind of going, what the hell is going on there?
Living next door to neighbors who yell all the time.
Yeah. And then for me, it was just like this feeling of, all of this sense of, being trapped and being in this weird hellhole and, yeah, thinking about like there are all these other people in the world that are not here, right? And they're having this totally different experience of reality. It was very, very interesting, very disturbing, actually, in a certain way. So anyway, but I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing.
I'm Mark Van Sunak. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination. And, this is an interesting topic because people don't like asking hard questions about Jesus. So that's part of what this makes this an interesting conversation. But the other piece, like we talk about this a fair bit, but I don't think we're going to be able to find any sort of justice in our society unless we can examine the way that Christian supremacy is part of what makes America tick. Because I don't know if this evangelical Christianity phenomenon that has tainted other things is kind of part of the fabric of why America's shitty. So we got to talk about what is it about people and their understanding of Jesus that leads them down this road to thinking, Trump's the guy.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
is that? What is that? What's going on
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. Yeah. And so, good morning, everybody. Appreciate all the initial comments. And yeah, so to me, the easy, obvious answer to this question is no. Jesus was not a fascist. But what is also uh, fairly clear to me is that the imperial church has turned Jesus into a fascist. Which is why I think what you were just saying becomes very possible, right? Where you can then see a leader like Trump as, the anointed come from God to fix everything. um, because you can take a lot of Jesus's pronouncements about whether it's about obedience, whether it's about doing certain things, or the parable of the wedding feast where the king gets pissed off at all these people and kills them and throws this guy out of the wedding because he's not dressed properly. It's like you can take all that stuff and turn it into fascism.
Sure.
And I think the church has done a good job with that, actually.
Well, I mean, look at the basic kind of operating system for a lot of, not just evangelicals, but a lot of conservative-minded Christians. There's this idea that God is at the top of a pyramid of authority, the pinnacle. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, if we think of God as being the absolute of the type of authority and power we see, then God is ultimately the law and order God. Mm-hmm. But you know what? We can't live by all the laws. We fall short and we deserve righteous punishment in hell. But then Jesus takes the punishment for us. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's already fascistic. And then the idea is like, well, but and they say, well, Jesus, he said these things. He said, love your enemy and love each other. That's my only command, friends. Like he said things like that. And then there's two angles that people will take with this. One is to say, yeah, but Jesus was God. He can do things different. Like Jesus flipped over the table of the money changers. Well, he could do that because it was his house. Like that kind of way of thinking where we over equate Jesus with deity to the point where we strip away any sort of point of comparison between us and him. And then the other little trick that people like to do is like, well, yeah, he came that way to show us one thing, but we know how the book of Revelation turns out. Jesus comes back to open up a can of divine whoop ass, purging all the impurity from the world and making the world great again.
Yeah. Right. So what you're talking about there is I think the sort of ultimate move in terms of turning Jesus into a fascist, right? Because if you look at the way that he lived and functioned, and you take that seriously, he's like the opposite of a fascist leader. I mean, he doesn't really care if his followers come and go. He's really bad at recruiting. He
tries to drive them away when they get too many.
He drives them away by saying crazy things. He doesn't really seem to care how they behave. And then he gets killed, right? And he disavows violence, and he disavows even his potential for violence, and just says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to behave that way. My kingdom is different. So if you take that seriously and you look at that and you go, well, no, I mean, there's no way that his actions promote this. But what people do, and I mean, I'll never forget this, and talking to this fundy about this, who said to me, well, yeah, he was nonviolent the first time he came, but when he comes back, he's going to be very violent. And this guy was like so excited, and so that's this really big bait and switch thing, where it's like, well, yeah, Jesus was a fascist. He just sort of tricked you the first time because he needed to do this weird death sacrifice thing to make everything okay. And
well, and that's the thing. Like, so this idea, if the center of your theology is divine retribution and how it was averted by the God man, then then you're going to go towards fascism, especially
Yeah.
then when you link it. Because to me, fascism has scholars argue all the time about what fascism is, but most people include things like you have the mythic leader who alone will save the country from its outside corruption, the outside corrupting forces. That's why fascists always point to liberals and communists and immigrants as the problem. But then also that this idea of restoring a victimized people to their former glory. So those are both very messianic seeming things. And if you squint and turn your head, you can see how Jesus might fit into that a little bit. Not quite. And if you're not savvy enough to know how Jesus uses certain ways of speaking and engaging things as a form of subversion, sometimes even satire, you miss all that. And so Jesus just seems like the ultimate. Like he tried to restore the nation of Israel to make it great again against its oppressors, and he alone could save them. And he didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And unless you hate your mother and father, you can have no part in his kingdom. And if you're not for me, you're against me. Like those are all statements Jesus said. If you take out of context, sounds very Trumpian.
Yeah. Yeah, that was good. You did a good job of stringing those together.
Well, I try.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some comments.
Let's roll some comments.
Go back to an earlier one. Sarah's writes, many people who are not in the U.S. are watching this like, is this a horror movie?
Yeah. Yeah, it was wild seeing the Canadians and talking to them about that. And they were just like, what is going on there? Yeah, it's pretty funny if it wasn't so terrible.
Mark writes, taking the words of Jesus out of context, particularly by parsing very small bits of his words, message, providing arguments for him being fascist, literal fundamentalist interpretations are most subject to this.
Right. Yeah, and that's what our Mark just did in a brilliant little way.
Thank you. The thing that's interesting to me, as a recovering fundamentalist in some ways, this great irony that they take everything super seriously except for when they don't want to take it seriously. Like they have a hermeneutic of selectivity just like everyone else, like a way of prioritizing certain passages over others. Everyone does that without exception. Now, the reason why that literalism is so important isn't because they want to cling to the very words of Jesus to become more whole human beings. It's because they have to have something absolute in its authority. And it has to be objective. You have to have this thing you can point to that says, this is how it's supposed to be. And if you don't do this, then you are an outsider. There's something wrong with you. You are to be purged. And so because the Spirit of God is so subjective, as we know, who we practice spiritual practices, it's just, why not have this book that's super authoritarian?
Yeah.
And anyone who defends the book will be our leader.
Yeah, and this is very much connected to the area of religious trauma, which is something that we've done a lot of work with, and it really starts with, as I like to say, God is this psychotic warlord, and so if you have this psychotic warlord who is basically after you if you don't do what he says, it's definitely a he. Then, I mean, anything that Jesus does is either some sort of cloak and dagger move to just get you to, kneel before the psychotic warlord, or it's sort of subservient to that basic stance. So it's very much connected to the issue of what is your image of God, right? And so, if your image of God is this basic authoritarian, narcissistic power monster, well, then when Trump comes along, you're just like, oh yeah, no, that fits perfectly, right? And but if your image of God is something different, both in terms of power, in terms of authority, in terms of our relationship to that, well, then you end up in a very different place. But examining one's starting point is something that people usually don't do very well.
That's right. Jonathan writes, listen to the song Leper Messiah by Metallica. The lyrics and song fit Trump and his quote-unquote Christian following to a T. It's amazing how art can be so on target. I don't know if I've ever heard that song. I listened to early Metallica. I'm wondering if that's something I missed or it's later Metallica, but I'll check that out as soon as we're done here. Crank it out. Theres writes, there are prophets in the Old Testament that can challenge God, but conservative fundies downplay that by applying their fascist lens. White liberal Christians tend to, in response, apply the horrible logic that God's anger is inherently oppressive and karmic. She puts karmic in quote because she's...
Right.
Yeah, that's another fascinating piece that... Because a lot of these folks will kind of want to say that, we know about God being kind of this petty tyrant because this is how the Old Testament portrays him. But then they'll gloss over all these fascinating parts in the Hebrew scriptures about wrestling with God, Moses being called a friend of God, the sorts of like the chaos and the differing images of God. Like we just no, we're just going to pick the ones that really fit us. And then when we get to Jesus, we're going to say like everything he did was just an act. Like,
right.
To show us how, hey, he's going to like be perfect to show us that we can't be perfect. Right?
Yeah.
It's some sort of object lesson of how we fail.
Yeah. And, and if we understand how the human mind works and we realize that our basic approach to reality, right, is to project ourselves and our ideas and our formation onto everything else. And we do that with the Bible, right? And so, and in many ways, those images of God in the Hebrew scripture come from that exact same process, right? So people experienced kings and emperors and tribal warlords and leaders and saw them as these powerful, often angry men. And so in part, that's where the image of God that you see when that shows through in the Bible comes from. And so then if that's your experience and that's your lens and that's your idea, right, God as king and father and Lord and all that stuff, it's just very easy to project that onto the entire scripture. And as you say, the parts that don't conform to that, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've had people say to me, oh, when Jesus says love your enemies, he's just kidding. And it's like, okay, well, if that's your perspective, it's sort of hard to argue with that.
If I don't have to, do you say, well, if I don't have to love my enemy, and then you punch them in the face?
Yeah.
Because then you can get away with it because they're being your enemy.
Right. That's right.
Ceres writes, they forget that God did not like monarchy in the first book of Samuel. I remember biblical studies classes at undergrad. Yeah, he didn't want to have a king at all. No. Which is, again, ironic. Like, given how the book of Judges is fairly anarchic compared to what we think, it's the idea that somehow God really wants us to have authoritarian government is kind of laughable. Yeah. There it is.
Yeah, no, I mean, that passage out of the first book of Samuel is just hilarious, right? I mean, God just goes through and just lists, like, these are all the terrible things that kings are going to do to you. They'll steal your stuff, they'll steal your stuff, they'll take your money, they'll do all this, that, and the other thing. And then people are still like, well, we still want a king anyway. And then so God's finally like, okay, fine, give him a king. And then, of course, the king does all those things that God said the king was going to do to you.
Mark writes, fascism is a works-based salvation model, which is in direct opposition to the good news that we've always been saved because of what God is. I mean, yeah, the salvation piece is huge. Like everything.
Well, that's the fascist hinge.
It is the fascist hinge. It's the evangelical hinge.
Yeah.
And then there's all sorts of other things about this. Talk about this, the way that evangelicalism creates an in-group and an out-group, and the out-group is somehow less human than the in-group. Because, I even wrote a paper in seminary about this, like that Christians have more sense perception. Like I wrote that because Calvin talked about the sensus divinitatis, which is that Christians have a divine sense, whereas non-Christians don't. So that means they're impaired. So like there's this isn't a new way of thinking, and it's been there all along. And
No.
Calvin was kind of fascistic too. He was a piece of crap when it comes to politics. I'm sorry for all you. I know you're Presbyterian, Dan. I'm sorry to savage your leader like that. Another piece of this, if we're going to talk about fascism and Jesus, we have to talk about anti-Semitism, given that the kind of the prominent fascist model we look at is Nazism, and the way theologies of replacement theology, which is this idea that Jews were chosen, but then God said, nah, you failed, and now the Christians are the chosen people. And that somehow, if you go through history, I've heard this a lot, there's always one country that leads the way in Christianity as a beacon of light to the world. And during the British Empire, it was Britain, but now it's America. And so we are a city on a hill, which is language that even Democrats use. And so we're set apart. And so this idea of being chosen in a way that replaces Jews really sets up a lot of horrible anti-Semitic shit.
Oh, yeah.
That, is part of the fascist soup.
Yeah. And, even the notion that Jesus was about creating a new religion, is in a way a historical turn that I think a real reading of the Bible doesn't support at all. I don't think Jesus was about creating a new religion. I think Jesus was actually about making everybody Jewish. But that's not the way that history turned out. And again, the Roman Empire saw that this movement was really a great tool for them to use to help get people in line. And so they picked up on this and then insisted. I mean, one of the reasons that the early church councils happened was not because the theologians were all like, oh, we need to get together and figure this out. It was because the Roman emperors wanted conformity. And they said, okay, you guys have got to figure this stuff out and give us a standardized theology that we can use throughout the empire. And that was why they kept calling these councils. And so again, that molding of this faith by the imperial hierarchy. And of course, then it's no coincidence that Roman Christianity looks exactly like the empire in terms of its governmental organization. That was an important part of creating what then we've inherited.
Yeah.
All right.
This could say a lot about the Roman influence and stuff, which I think is another huge piece of it, because that's where the shift happens, where instead of Jesus being maybe seen as a counter emperor, which is kind of the language they're using, subverting the idea of power altogether, to being like, no, he just trumps the emperor. So he's the emperor of emperors, the king of kings, is taken, and all of its irony is stripped away. Nothing, fundamentalists, few things they hate more than subtlety and irony, which if you don't have subtlety and irony, you can't understand, and humor. If you don't have those things, you can't even understand anything in scripture, because it's just bathed in that stuff.
Yeah.
Unless you pledge loyalty to Jesus, you burn.
Yeah.
Another piece
I
of
mean,
it.
you can't get more fascist than that.
Ed writes, people have not been given enough mystical spirituality that does not depend solely on Jesus. You look at Francis or Aquinas or Hildegard, and they have a very strong creation spirituality to accompany an understanding of following Jesus. I think we need to give people a stronger context of creation spirituality in which to understand Jesus. I mean, that's,
and that's why I just wrote this book, exactly on that. Thanks, Ed.
How providential.
It's amazing.
I mean, I think that's a big piece of it too, like, because we have this sense as human beings that there's creation, animals, and then we're somehow above it. Like God is way above it, and we're a little bit above it, and so we're detached. And so the idea that this whole way of engaging Christianity is a way to make us even increasingly detached. You can blame Plato. People blame Plato for that, and I think that's actually unfair, because Platonism is much more sophisticated than that. But this idea of us having a separation from creation, like hatred of our bodies, that's been baked in since early on, and that leads towards fascism too. Because then, if you have that understanding, you read passages like "Go to the ends of the earth and make it fruitful and multiply." You start seeing the earth as something you dominate. That's something apart from you.
Yeah.
And then if you travel around the world and see people who aren't being as productive with the land, then you have a divine obligation to take it from them and make it fruitful. Like, it's all part of this imperial way of seeing things. And we don't realize how much our interpretations of these core texts have been so skewed to the point we can't even understand what was going on.
Well, and then, I mean, so it starts out, it becomes imperial, and then it becomes colonial, right? And so then when, you get to the 15th, 16th century, and all these folks start heading out in boats all over the world, they take that Christianity with them. And now, and we were talking about this some with the in this class last night, because this book group, because there's this contrast between, the native medicine wheel and the colonial us, them, either or view. And I said, well, if you don't get rid of imperial Christianity, you can't embrace something like the medicine wheel, which says that, all people, all colors, all types, all religions, are part of this whole. Well, that's way too anti-imperial for the colonists. It's like, no, as you were saying earlier, like, we have that extra sense perception. We are better than you. And so we get to take you over and kill you if you don't do what we say.
Ceres believes Calvin needs to be knocked off the pedestal.
Yeah, whatever pedestal.
I'm pretty much okay with all of those magisterial reformers getting knocked off their pedestal. Luther was also a fascistic piece of crap. Sided with not only was he anti-Semitic, but he sided with the princes of Germany over and against the peasants. The only peasant people that sided with the peasants' revolt were the Anabaptists, and they kind of, like, most of them got wiped out, and we only got the people who avoided struggle. The Mennonites are the ones who survived. So we should, we need a do-over.
De-pedestalize.
Yeah. Ed writes, Jewish spirituality had a very strong earth-based spirituality. Catherine writes, apparently there are Christians out there who like comparing Trump's bombasticness, wow, I've never even heard that word before, bombasticness, to the Old Testament God. This too draws on some inherently contradictory and anti-Semitic theology. You're right.
Yeah. And again, as we're saying, this is easy to do if you make a certain sort of set of assumptions and theological and hermeneutical maneuvers. And whoops, there we go. I'm back. Yeah, and you can get all kinds of crazy out of this, and this happens with every religion, right? So, people look, for example, at Sri Lanka, and they're like, "How do you get all these violent Buddhists?" Well, I mean, it's the same. It's the same thing. I mean, you can take any religion, and as soon as you turn your salvation model, whether that's enlightenment or fruition of your karma, or whatever it happens to be, you take that as the be all end all best and sort of only way, and that's it. I mean, now you're on the fascism trail.
Yay. Ceres writes, I really wish that there is a way to reclaim the book of Revelation as an anti-imperialist book, which it really is, since Emperor Roll is characterized very negatively. One book that I think, I'm sure there are a bunch of them, but Wes Howard Brooke, who's a friend of mine, co-wrote a book called, what is it called? Unveiling Empire. And it's about the book of Revelation. There's
also a book by a woman, and I'm not going to remember either her name or the title of the name, but she wrote it about 4 or 5 years ago, which actually does a really good job of exactly that.
Specifically with the Book of Revelation.
With the Book of Revelation. Yep.
Yeah, so it's out there, but the problem is that it's already a hard book to preach out of, and so much of the weird, crappy Left Behind stuff has dominated our cultural imagination. So it really is an uphill battle to engage that text in any way that's liberatory, because of how pervasive, like, the locusts are helicopters, like kind of thinking there is. Timothy writes, fascism is often hard to define because the original fascists in France, Italy, Germany, and Spain were anti-intellectual and did not have a manifesto or much other literature. That's right. But elements are authoritarianism, corporatism, racism, militarism, and populism. Yeah. Well, to me, again, I think I've already said this, I say this a lot, but really this idea of law and order is at the core of it. Like, you notice how people get upset, like if someone's jaywalking and they almost get hit by a car, you can tell someone who's law and order minded saying, well, if they would have got hit, it would have been what's coming to them. Like, they think that if you infract a law, that you get what's coming to you. So protesters blocking the interstate, if a semi-truck drives into it, like, well, what do they expect? They have what's coming to them. This sort of quick way of thinking, or like whenever some black man is killed, they find out, oh, he did drugs when he was in high school. He had it coming. This sort of way of, like, you do certain things that now puts you on the outside, and now you are animalistic or a corrupting force. That mentality is kind of at the core of fascism. This need to purge outside corrupting influences, and it's at the core of most expressions of Christianity in our country. This idea of being
you do something wrong. Yeah, you do something wrong and you go to hell. And again, this is a source of a lot of religious trauma. We haven't really talked much directly about religious trauma in this time, but this is an enormous problem. And and certainly what's going on in our country right now is one manifestation of that. And and it's you see it in people's attitudes about dealing with the coronavirus, right? I mean, there was this guy that showed up at the Grand Forks, North Dakota City Council meeting the other day when they were voting for a mask mandate, and this psycho is just screaming at them and says, you take care of your own grandmother. I'm not going to take care of her for you. Right.
So much compassion.
So much compassion. So yeah, and I'm sure he considers himself a good Christian.
Mask mandates you don't have to follow because Democrats aren't proper authority. That's how they get out of that one.
And God doesn't like you being muzzled.
No. Sirius writes, cults are characterized negatively as well in the book, but we all know fundies. Yep. Yeah. And Jeremy writes, Apocalypse and Allegiance by J. Nelson Craybill, who's a Mennonite scholar, reads Revelation that way. So there's another. So there's some out there.
There's some out there.
They don't make really good fictionized accounts. You're not going to see Tim LaHaye and Jerry D. Jenkins writing a series based upon an anti-imperial read of Revelation. No, unfortunately.
Oh, well. Okay. Well, we blazed through. Hey, listen, we've got another guest on Monday. I'm really excited about it. Dr. Don Matthews, who's done a lot of work in terms of recognizing the reality of the Black peoples of Africa and being part of the Bible and being really the drivers in a lot of civilization, and how Western Christianity has really whitewashed a lot of these peoples. And so it's going to be fun. He's got a new book out, and he's a great guy. So very excited to have him with us on Monday.
And we're going to close with Susan's words. You got one in right under the wire. I was thinking about something the other day. If fundies are so adamant in protecting the life of unborn babies over and above the lives of existing humans, and original sin means even the unborn babies are sinful, how can they be innocent and need to be protected from what's coming from them? I mean, you want to deal with sin, you might as well nip it in the bud.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it.
No, I mean, expecting any sort of logic out of a lot of this stuff is not, you're not going to find it.
I'm increasingly convinced all the time that it's not about caring about unborn babies.
No,
It's
no,
the
it
perfect.
really
It's
isn't.
going to be a voice for the voiceless. Find people who are actually
Yes.
voiceless, so you can use them as a tool for your own power. But that's a whole other
All
conversation
righty.
time. See y'all
Great.
on Monday.
Yep. Thanks for the comments.
Enjoy
Bye.
the last weekend of freedom before fascism comes in on
Yes.
Tuesday, I guess. So,
Enjoy your
yay.
candy and your extra hour.
Check your
sleep
apples
on
for razor
Sunday.
blades. We'll see y'all on Monday.